Good morning, and welcome to today's Deep Dive Intelligence Explainer. It's May 20th, 2026, and today we're focusing our lens squarely on the Middle East. Specifically, we're going to break down the incredibly complex situation unfolding in Lebanon right now. Our goal here is simple: to deliver a calm, clear, and entirely neutral assessment of the facts on the ground over the past 2 weeks. Now, before we get into the analysis, we do want to acknowledge the sponsor of today's briefing, ProWave AI. They're absolutely dedicated to powering intelligence for the modern era, and we're thrilled to have them on board. Along those same lines, this explainer is actually generated by Stylo News, an AI-powered news application. What's really fascinating about Stylo News is that it brings enterprise-grade intelligence straight to the public. It's essentially the consumer version of the Stylo Intel Ops software, the exact same tech trusted by government, military, and business operations around the world. So you, as a listener, get unique access to the very same caliber of situational awareness tools that global decision-makers use every single day. All right, let's look at the rundown for today. We're going to objectively cover 4 main areas. First up, state fragility and domestic sentiment. Then we'll map out the conflict dynamics and deterrence between Israel and Hezbollah. Third, we'll assess the current risks to foreign personnel. And finally, we'll wrap up with a future outlook and some key watch points. Okay, let's get right into our first major topic: state fragility and domestic sentiment. We really need to look at the current operational status of the Lebanese government. When we look at domestic sentiment within Lebanon, it is, frankly, starkly divided. On one hand, you have constituencies, primarily among the Christian, Sunni, and Druze communities, who strongly favor state-led disarmament. They're looking for broader stability anchored by the Lebanese armed forces. But on the other hand, you have pro-resistance constituencies who are highly mobilized around Hezbollah's armed operations. In fact, if you look at social media sentiment from these groups, they frequently label any state compromises as Zionist. So as you can imagine, this polarization creates some massive hurdles for anyone trying to put together a unified national security strategy. To really understand the government's position, consider this assessment. The Lebanese government is stable enough to persist administratively, but too weak to decisively control the main driver of war risk on its territory. What does that actually mean for us? Well, it means leaders like Prime Minister Nawaf Salam and President Aoun are still there, the institutions are intact, they're holding diplomatic talks, and they're projecting sovereignty. But they simply lack the monopoly on force required to actually constrain Hezbollah's military operations. So administratively, the government persists, but strategically, it remains incredibly weak. Shifting our focus now to the kinetic realities on the ground, let's examine the actual conflict dynamics and deterrence strategies we've seen over the first half of May. Let's just walk through the timeline of events here. Early May kicked off with sustained border combat, and that was despite a nominal truce framework being in place. Then, by May 7th, we saw a notable escalation. Israel conducted a highly targeted strike in Beirut's southern suburbs, specifically targeting a senior Hezbollah Radwan force commander. But here's the interesting part. Despite that clear kinetic tension, active diplomacy actually continued behind the scenes. And that ultimately resulted in a formal 45-day ceasefire extension reached on May 16th. Geographically speaking, these military actions are very distinctly divided. Down in the primary border combat zones of southern Lebanon, think areas around Bint Jbeil and the Litani River sector, we've seen sustained low to moderate attrition warfare. But as you move northward, the dynamic changes. That's where we see the escalation indicators, like those specific strike locations approaching Beirut's southern suburbs, an area known as Dahia. When we objectively evaluate the tactical courses of action here, we see 2 very distinct approaches. Hezbollah has been increasingly leaning on advanced FPV and hard-to-jam fiber optic drones. Their strategic goal? To maintain constant military pressure. Conversely, Israel has relied heavily on airstrikes and infrastructure demolitions to enforce deterrence and actively degrade those capabilities. Now, both actors seem to prefer this sort of calibrated attrition over an immediate full-scale war. But make no mistake, the threshold for broader conflict remains dangerously low. Let's transition now to what this all means for people on the ground, specifically the international threat assessment and risks to foreign personnel. Now, we're presenting these facts purely to provide situational awareness, absolutely not to cause unnecessary alarm. For U.S. and Western personnel operating in Lebanon, the risks are primarily environmental. We're talking about indirect fire exposure in the south, route and transit insecurity, and of course the potential for sudden civil unrest in major urban centers. There's also a nuanced dynamic, where public U.S. pressure on the Lebanese armed forces to disarm Hezbollah runs the risk of sparking anti-Western backlash. But, and this is absolutely crucial to emphasize, current intelligence confirms there are no verified direct mass casualty plots against Western embassies right now. The threat environment is definitely elevated, but it is primarily indirect and collateral. As we conclude the intelligence portion of our explainer, let's take a look ahead. What are the key watch points we need to be monitoring? Moving forward, global decision makers are laser focused on three primary indicators. Step one is the durability of that 45-day ceasefire extension. Is it going to hold, or will tactical violations cause it to collapse? Step two, we're watching the deployment and actions of the Lebanese armed forces. Will they start deploying more assertively south of the Litani River? And finally, step three is the broader trajectory of US and Iran regional talks. The outcome of those discussions will heavily influence Hezbollah's overall strategic calculus. All right, before we go, let's talk about empowering your own daily intelligence. If you want to stay ahead of rapidly developing situations just like this one, I warmly encourage you to check out Stylo News. You can easily download the app for your mobile device or computer over at www.stylonews.com. It's a fantastic tool that lets you customize your very own AI-powered intelligence briefs. It aggregates data from hundreds of traditional news sources, plus social media platforms like X, to deliver personalized, on-demand intelligence right to your screen. It is a real game changer for staying informed. So, I'll leave you with this final, rather provocative thought to mull over. Will Lebanon's fragile state manage to assert its sovereignty during this brief 45-day window of calm? Or will regional proxy forces continue to dictate the nation's future? Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Deep Dive Explainer. Please feel free to reach out and request topics for future deep dives, and be sure to follow Stylo News on your favorite social media platforms. Have a great, informed day.